We will get started. Club Retro, yeah. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, some questions on development. We're going to talk about things before the contact with Europe. So, all right, and here's a quote from Che Guevara. In contrast with the surging growth of the countries in the socialist camps and the development taking place, albeit much more slowly, in the majority of the capitalist countries, is the unquestionable fact that a large proportion of the so-called underdeveloped countries are in total stagnation, and that in some of them the rate of economic growth is lower than of the population increase. Do I have anything? I don't think I have anything. I have 0 coins. These characteristics are not fortuitous. They correspond strictly in the nature of the capitalist system in full expansion, which transfers to the dependent countries of the most abusive and barefaced forms of exploitation. It must be clearly understood that the only way to solve the question now besetting mankind is to eliminate completely the exploitation of independent countries by developed capitalist countries with all the consequences that this implies. Che Guevara, 1964. Let's get started. What is development? Development in a human society is a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it implies increased skills and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. Some of these are virtually moral categories and are difficult to evaluate, depending as they do on the age in which one lives, one's class origins, one's personal code of what is wrong. However, what is indisputable is that the achievement of any of these aspects of personal development is very much tied in with the state of the society as a whole. From earliest times, man found it convenient and necessary to come together in groups to hunt and for the sake of survival. The relations which develop within any given social group are crucial to an understanding of the society as a whole. Freedom, responsibility, skill have real meaning only in terms of the relations of men in society. Of course, each social group comes into contact with others. The relationships between individuals in any two societies are regulated by the form of the two societies. Their respective political structures are important because the ruling elements within each group are the ones that begin to have dialogue, trade, or fight, as the case may be. At the level of social groups, therefore, development implies an increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. Much of human history has been a fight for survival against natural hazards and against real and imagined human enemies. Development in the past has always meant the increase in the ability to guard the independence of the socialist group, and indeed to infringe upon the freedom of others, something that often come about in perspective of the will of the persons within the societies involved. Men are not the only beings that operate in groups, but the human species embarked upon a unique line of development because man had the capacity to make and use tools. The very act of making tools was a stimulus to the increasing rationality rather than the consequences of a full matured intellect. In historical terms, man, the worker, has every bit as important as man, the tinkerer. the thinker, sorry, because the work with tools liberated men from sheer physical necessity, so that he could impose himself upon other more powerful species and upon nature itself. The tools with which men work and the manner in which they organize their labor are both important indices of social development. More often than not, the term, quote, development, end quote, is used in an exclusive economic sense. The justification being that the type of economy is itself an index of other social features. What then is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly their capacity to dealing with the environment. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature, science, on the extent to which they put that understanding into practice by devising tools, technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. Taking a long-term view, it can be said that there has been constant economic development within human society since the origins of man, because man has multiplied enormously his capacity to win a living from nature. The magnitude of man's achievement is best understood by reflecting on the curly history of human society and noting the following. Firstly, the progress from crude stone tools to the use of metals. Secondly, the changeover from hunting and gathering wild fruit to the domestication of animals and the growing of food and crops. Thirdly, the improvement of organization of work from being an individualistic activity towards being an activity which assumes a social character through the participation of many. Every people have shown the capacity for independently increasing their abilities to live and more satisfactory life through exploiting the resources of nature. Every continent independently participated in the early epochs of the extension of man's control over his environment, which means, in effect, that every continent can point to a period of economic development. Africa, being the original home of man, was obviously a major participant in the processes in which human groups displayed an ever-increasing capacity to extract a living from natural environment. Indeed, in the earlier periods, Africa was the focus of the physical development of man as such, as distinct from other living beings. Development was universal because the conditions leading to economic expansion were universal. Everywhere man has faced with the task of survival by meeting fundamental material needs and better tools where the consequences of the interplay between human beings and nature as a part of the struggle for survival. Of course, human history is not a record of advances and nothing. Let me read that. Of course, human history is not a record of advances of nothing else. There are periods in every part of the world when there were temporary setbacks and actual reduction of the capacity to produce basic necessities and other services for the population. But the overall tendency was towards increased production, and at given points of time, the increase in the quantity of foods was associated with the change in the quantity of character of society. This will be shown later with reference to Africa, but to indicate the universal application of the principle of quantitative/qualitative change, an example will be drawn from China. What's going on here is a reading. Reading is going on. Whoops! There, look at. I'm glad I kept my finger there. Sorry, buddy. All right.
Please هدي يا عمو خفف الصورة عمو. والله صورة القسطامو بليز.
Early man in China lived at the mercy of nature. The slowly discoveries such basic things as the fact that fire can be man-made and that seeds of some grasses could be planted in the soil to meet food requirements. Those discoveries helped inhabitants in China to have simple farming communities using stone tools and produce enough for bare subsistence. That was achieved several thousand years before the birth of Christ, or the flight of Prophet Muhammad. The goods produced at that stage were divided more or less equally among the members of society, who lived and worked in families. By the time of the Tang Dynasty of the 7th century AD, China had expanded its economic capacity not only to grow more food, but also to manufacture a wide variety of items such as silk, porcelain, ships, and scientific devices. This, of course, represented the quantitative increase in the goods produced. It was interrelated with qualitative changes in Chinese society. By the later date, there was a political state, where before there were only self-governing units. Instead of every family and every individual performing the task of agriculturalists, house builders, tailors, there had risen specialization of function. Most of the population still tilled the land, but there were skilled artisans who made silk and porcelain, bureaucrats who administered the state, the Buddhist and the Confucian, religious philosophers who specialized in trying to explain those things that lay outside of the immediate understanding. Specialization and division of labor led to more production, as well as inequality in distribution. A small section of Chinese society came to take a disproportionate share of the proceeds of human labor, and that was the section which did least to actually generate wealth by working in agriculture or industries. They could afford to do so because grave iniquities had emerged in the ownership of the basic means of production, which was the land. Family land became smaller as far as most peasants were concerned, and the minority took over the greater portions of the land. Those changes in the land tenure were part and parceled of development in its broadest sense. That is why development cannot be seen purely as an economic affair, but rather as an overall social process which is independent upon the outcome of man's effort to deal with his natural environment. Through careful studies, it is possible to comprehend some of the very complicated links between the changes in the economic base and change in the rest of the superstructure of the society, including the spheres of ideology and social belief. The changeover from communalism in Asia and Europe led, for instance, to codes of behavior peculiar to feudalism. The conduct of the European knights in armor had much in common with that of the Japanese samurai or warriors. They developed notions of so-called chivalry. Conduct becoming a gentleman knight on horseback, while in contrast, the peasants had to learn extreme humility, difference, and obsequiousness. I'm going to look up this word. My first word of the day. Come on. Here we go. All right, we're not there. There we go. Oops, wrong word.
بليز عمو هدية قفت بليز وضح لي الصورة يا عمو.
Anybody
بليز
please?
يا عمو وضح لي الصورة.
Anybody? All right, let's find out what this word says.
Obsequious.
Obsequiousness. Obsequiousness, which means obedient or attentive to an exclusive or servile degree, a servile degree. So, let me reread this.
Obsequious.
All right, obsequiousness symbolized by doffing his cap and standing barehanded before his superiors. In Africa, too, it was to be found that the rise of the state and superior classes led to the practice whereby common subjects prostrated themselves in the presence of the monarchs and aristocrats. When that point had been reached, it became clear that the rough equality of the family had given way to a new state of society. In the natural sciences, it is well known that quantitative change becomes qualitative after a certain period. A common example is the way that water can absorb heat, a quantitative process, until at 100 degrees Celsius it changes to steam, a qualitative change and form. Similarly, in human society, it has always been the case that the expansion of the economy led eventually to a change in the form of social relations. Karl Marx writing in the 19th century was the first writer to appreciate this, and he's distinguished within European history several stages of development. The first major stage following after simple bands of hunters was communalism, where property was collectively owned, work was done in common, and goods were shared equally. The second was slavery, caused by the extension of domineering elements within the family and by some group being physically overwhelmed by others. Slaves did a variety of tasks, but their main job was to produce food. The next stage was feudalism, where agriculture remains the principal means of making a livelihood, but the land which was necessary for that purpose was in the hands of the few, and they took the lion's share of the wealth. The workers on the land, now called serfs, were no longer the personal property of the master, but were tied to the land of the particular manor or state. When the manor changed hands, the serfs had to remain there and provide goods for the landlord, just keeping enough to feed themselves, just as children of a slave was a slave, so the children of a serf were also serfs. Then came capitalism, under which the greatest wealth of the society was produced not in agriculture, but by machines, in factories and in mines. Like the preceding phase of feudalism, capitalism was characterized by the concentration in a few hands of ownership of the means of producing wealth, and by unequal distribution of the products of human labor. The few who dominated were the bourgeoisie, who had originated in the merchants and craftsmen of the feudal epoch, and who rose to be industrialists and financiers. Meanwhile, the serfs were declared legally free to leave the land, and so in search of employment in the capitalist enterprises. Their labor thereby became a commodity, something to be bought and sold. We all got IQs. That's great. Good way of using the IQ. All right. It was predicted that there would be a further stage, that of socialism, which in which the principle of economic equality would be restored as in communalism. In the present century, the phase of socialism has indeed emerged in some countries. Economically, each succeeding stage represented development in the strict sense that there was increased capacity to control the material environment and thereby to create more goods and services for the community. The greater quantity of goods and services are based on a greater skill of human inventiveness. Man was liberated in the sense of having more opportunities to display the development of his talents. Whether man uplifted himself in a moral sense is open to dispute. The advance in production increased the range of powers which section of society had over other sections, and it multiplied the violence which was part of the competition for survival and growth among social groups. It is not at all clear that a soldier serving capitalism in the last World War was less, quote, the P word, in the element sense of the whole of the word than a soldier serving in one Japanese feudal armies in the 16th century, or for that matter, than a hunter living in the first phase of human organization in the forest of Brazil. Nevertheless, we do not know that in those three respective epochs, hunting hand, feudalism, capitalism, and quality of life improved. It became less hazardous, less uncertain, and members of society potentially had greater choices over their destinies. All of that is involved when the word, quote, development is used. In the history of those societies which have passed through several modes of production, the opportunity is presented of seeing how quantitative changes give rise ultimately to entirely different societies. The key features is that at given junctures, the social relations in the societies were no longer affected in promoting advance. Indeed, they began to act as brakes on the productive forces and therefore had to be discarded. Taking, for instance, the epoch of slavery in Europe. However morally indispensable slavery may have been, it did serve for a while to open up the mines and agricultural plantations in large parts of Europe, and notably within Roman Empire. But then those peasants who remained free had their land depressed and underutilized because of the presence of slaves. The slaves were not disposed to work at any task requiring skill. So the technological evolution of society threatened to come to a halt. Furthermore, the slaves were restless, and slaves' revolts were expensive to put down. The landowners, seeing their estates going to ruin, decided that it would be best to grant the legal freedom for which slaves were clamoring and to keep exploiting the labor of these free serfs to ensuring that they had no lands to plow other than those of the landlords. Thereby, a new set of social relations, that of landlords and serf, replaced the old relations of slave master and slave. In some instances, the changeover to a new mode was accompanied by violence at a crucial point. This occurred when the ruling class involved were being threatened with removal by the process of change. The feudal lords remained in power for centuries, during which the merchants and manufacturing interests grew wealthy and sought to achieve political power and social preeminence. When classes are so well defined, their consciousness is at a high level. Both the landlord class and the capitalists recognized that was at stake. The former fought to hold on to the social relations which no longer correspond to the new technology of machine production and organization of work by means of purchasing labor power. The capitalists flung themselves into the revolution in Europe in the 18th and 19th century to break the old relations of production. The notion of revolution and class consciousness must be born in the minds that it comes to examining the situation of the modern worker and peasant class in Africa. However, for the greater part of Africa's history, the existing classes have been incompletely crystallized, and the changes have been gradually rather than revolutionary. What is probably of more relevance of earlier African development is the principle that development over the world's territories has always been uneven. While all societies have experienced development, it is equally true that the rate of development differs from continent to continent, and within each continent, different parts increase their command over nature at different rates. Inside Africa, Egyptians were capable of producing wealth in abundance 25 centuries ago because of mastery of many scientific natural laws and their inventions or technology to irrigate, grow food, extract minerals from the subsoil. At that time, hunting with bows and even wooden clubs was that people depended on for survivals in most parts of African continent. In various other places, such as the British Isles, one of the most difficult questions to answer is exactly why different peoples develop at different rates when left on their own. Part of the answer lies in the environment in which human groups evolved, and part of it lies in the superstructure of human society. That is to say, as human beings battle with the material environment, they create forms of social relations, forms of government, patterns of behavior, and systems of belief, which together constituted the superstructure, which was never the same in any two societies. Each element in the superstructure, as well as with the material base. For instance, the political and religious patterns affected each other and were often intertwined. The religious belief that a certain forest was sacred was the kind of element in the superstructure that affected economic activity, since that forest would not be cleared for cultivation. While in the final analysis, the breakthrough to a new stage of human development is developed upon man's technical capacity to deal with the environment. It is also to be born in the minds of particularities in the superstructure of any given society, have a marked impact in the state of development. Oh, it's Finn. Hey, Finn. Just checking. Many observers have been puzzled by the fact that China never became capitalist. It entered the feudal phase of development virtually 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. It was developed. Many it had developed many aspects of technology. It had many craftsmen and artisans. Yet the mode of production was never transformed to one where machines were the main means of producing wealth and where the owners of capital would be the dominant class. The explanation is very complex, but in general terms, the main difference between feudal Europe and feudal China laid in the superstructure, i.e. in the body of beliefs, motivations, and social political institutions which derive from the material base by in turn affected it. In China, religious, educational, and bureaucratic qualifications were of utmost importance, and government was in the hands of the state officials rather than being run by the landlords on their own feudal states. Besides, there were greater egalitarian tendencies in China land distribution than in European land distribution. And the Chinese state owned the greater deal of the land. The consequence was that the landowners had great powers as bureaucrats than as men of property, and they used that to keep social relations in the same mold. It would have been impossible for them to have done that indefinitely, but they slowed down the movement of history. In Europe, the elements of change were not stifled by the weight of the state of bureaucracy. As soon as the first capitalists appeared in Europe, society and incentives was created for further development through the attitude of this class. Never before in human society had a group of people seen themselves cautiously functioning in order to make the maximum profit out of production. To fulfill their objective of acquiring more and more capital, capitalists took a greater interest in the law of science, which could be harnessed in a form of machinery to work and make profits on their behalf. At the political level, capitalism was also foremost of the features which today are referred to Western democracy. In abolishing feudalism, the capitalists insisted on parliaments, constitutions, freedom of press. These too can be considered as development. However, the peasants and the workers of Europe, and eventually the inhabitants of the whole world, paid a huge price so that the capitalists could make their profit front the human labor that always lies behind the machines. That contradiction, other facets of the development, especially viewed front the standpoint of those who suffered and still suffer to make capitalist achievements possible. This latter group are the majority of mankind. To advance, they must overthrow capitalism. And that is why, at the moment, capitalism stands in the path of further human social development. To put it another way, the social class relations of capitalism are now outmoded, just as slaves and feudal relations became outmoded in their time. There was a period when the capitalist system increased the well-being of significant numbers of people as a byproduct of seeking out profit for a few. But today, the quest of profits come into sharp conflict with people's demand that their material and social needs should be fulfilled. The capitalist bourgeoisie class is no longer capable of guiding the uninhabited development of science and technology. Again, because these objectives now clash with the profit motive. Capitalism has proved incapable of transcending fundamental weaknesses such as underutilization of productive capacity, the persistence of the permanent sectors of unemployment, and periodic economic crisis relating to the concept of, quote, market, end quote, which is concerned with people's ability to pay rather than their need for commodities. Capitalism has created its own irrationalities, such as a vicious white racism, a tremendous waste associated with advertising, and the irrationality of incredible poverty in the economics, in the midst of wealth and wastage, even inside the biggest capitalist economies, such as that of the United States of America. Above all, capitalism has intensified its own political contradictions in trying to subjugate nations and continents outside of Europe, so that the workers and peasants in every part of the globe have become self-conscious and are determined to take their destiny into their own hands. Such a determination is also an integral part of the process of development. It can be afforded as a generalization that all phases of development are temporary and transcendent, and are destined sooner or later to give way to something else. It is particularly important to stress this with reference to capitalism, because the capitalist epoch is not quite over, and those who live at a particular point in time often fail to see that their way of life is in the process of transformation and elimination. Indeed, it is one of the functions of those bourgeoisie writers who justify capitalism to try to pretend that capitalism is here to stay. A glance at the remarkable advance of socialism over the last 50-odd years will show that the apologists for capitalism are spokesmen of a social system that is rapidly expiring. The fact that capitalism today is still around alongside socialism should warn us that the modes of production cannot simply be viewed as a question of successive stages. Uneven development has always assured that societies have come into contact when they were at different levels. For example, one that was communal and one that was capitalist. When two societies of different sorts come into prolonged and effective contact, the rate of of change taking place in both is seriously affected to the extent that entirely new patterns are created. Two general rules can be observed to apply in such cases. First, the weaker of the two societies, i.e. the one with less economic capacity, is bound to be adversely affected, and the bigger the gap between the two societies concerned, the more detrimental are the consequences. For example, when European capitalism came into contact with the indigenous hunting society of America and the Caribbean, the latter were virtually exterminated. Secondly, assuming that the weaker society does survive, then ultimately it can resume its own independent development, only if it proceeds to the level higher than that of the economy which had previously dominated it. The concrete instances of the operations of this second rule are found in the experience of the Soviet Union, China and Korea. China and Korea were both at the stage approximating feudalism when they were colonized by the capitalist powers of Europe and Japan. Russia was never legally colonized, but while in the feudal stages and before its own indigenous capitalism could get very far, the Russian economy was subjugated by the most matured capitalism of Western Europe. In all three cases, it took a socialist revolution to break the domination of capitalism. and only the rapid tempo of socialist development could make amends for the period of subjugation when growth was misdirected and slowed down. Indeed, as far as the two biggest socialist states are concerned, the Soviet Union and China, socialist development has already capitulated them beyond states such as Britain and France, which have been following the capitalist path for centuries. Going back real quick, taking a small little break. Just going back real quick, make sure. Nope, didn't miss anything. Up to the end of the 1950s, the point at which this study terminates, Russia, China, Korea, and certain nations in the Eastern Europe were the only countries which had divisively broken with capitalism and imperialism. Imperialism in itself a phase of capitalist development in which European capitalist countries, the US and Japan, established political, economic, military, and cultural hegemony over the parts of the world which were initially at the lower level and therefore could not resist domination. Imperialism was in effect the extended capitalist system which for many years embraced the whole world, one part being the exploiters and the other the exploited, one part being dominant and the other acting as overlords, one part making policy and the other being dependent. Let me do something real quick. Socialism has advanced on imperialism, weakest flanks in the sectors that is exploited, oppressed, and reduced to dependency. In Asia, Eastern Europe, socialism released the nationalist energies of colonized peoples. It turned the goal of production away from the money market and towards the satisfaction of human needs. It has eradicated bottlenecks such as permanent unemployment and periodic crises, and it has realized some of the promised implicit in Western or bourgeoisie democracy by providing the equality of economic conditions which is necessary before one can make use of political equality and equity. Equality before the law. Socialism has reinstated the economic quality of communalism, but communalism fell apart because of low economic productivity and scarcity. Socialism aims and has significantly achieved the creation of plenty, so that the principle of egalitarian distribution becomes consistent with the satisfaction of the wants of all members of society. One of the most crucial factors leading to more rapid and consistent expansion of economic capacity under socialism had been the implementation of planned development. Most of the historical processes so far described relate to involuntary and unplanned development. No one planned that at a given stage, human beings should cease using stone axes and use iron implements instead. And to come to more recent times, while individual capitalist firms plan their own expansion, their system is not geared to overall planning of the economy and the society. The capitalist state intervened only fitfully and partially to supervise capitalist development. The socialist state has as its prime function the control of the economy on behalf of the working class. The latter, i.e. workers and peasants, have now become the most dynamic force in world history and human development. To conclude this brief introduction to the extremely complex problem of social development, it is useful to recognize how inadequate are the explanation of that phenomenon which are provided by the bourgeois scholars. They very seldom try to grapple with the issue in its totality, but rather concentrate attention narrowly on, quote, economic development. As defined by the average bourgeoisie economist, development becomes simply a matter of the combination of given, quote, factors and production, end quote, namely land, population, capital, technology, specialization, and large-scale production. Those factors are indeed relevant as it implies in the analysis so far, but omission from the list of that what bourgeoisie scholars think relevant are really overwhelmingly. No mention is made of the exploitation of the majority which underlay all development prior to socialism. No mention is made of the social relations of production or the classes. No mention is made of the way that the factors of relations of production combined to the form of distinctive systems or mode of production, varying from the one historical epoch to another. No mention is made of the imperialism as the logical phase of capitalism. No contrast, any approach which tries to base itself on socialist and revolutionary principles must certainly introduce into the discussion at the earliest possible point the concepts of class, imperialism, socialism, as well as the roles of workers and oppressed people. Each new concept bristly with its own complications, and it is not to be imagined that the mere resort to certain terminology is answered to anything. However, one has at least to recognize the full human, historical, and social dimensions of development before it is feasible to consider, quote, underdevelopment or the stages of escaping from underdevelopment. And that's that section. That was a good section. Hold on a second. I don't know. Just bringing people up. People can. Yep. Not too many people coming in, but that's okay. All right. Next section. What is underdevelopment? Having discussed development, it is easier to comprehend the concepts of underdevelopment. Obviously, underdevelopment is an absence of. Hold on a second. I think she is. No. Weird. How do they stop that? Okay. Let me read this again. Having discussed development, it is easier to comprehend the concept of underdevelopment. Obviously, underdevelopment is not absent of development because every people have developed in one way or another, and to a greater or lesser extent. Underdeveloped makes sense only in the means of comparing levels of development. It is very much tied to the fact that human social development has been uneven, and from the strictly economic viewpoint, some human groups have advanced further by producing more and becoming more wealthy. And the moment that one group appears to be wealthier than others, some inquiry is bound to take place as to the reason for the difference. After Britain had begun to move ahead of the rest of Europe in the 18th century, the famous British economist Adam Smith felt it necessary to look into causes behind the, quote, wealth of nations, end quote. At the same time, many Russians were very concerned about the fact that their country was, quote, backward in comparison with England, France, and Germany. In the 18th century, subsequently in the 19th century, today our main preoccupation is with the differences in wealth between one on the one hand, between on the one hand Europe and North America, and on the other hand Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In comparison with the first and second group, can be said to be backward or underdeveloped. At all times, therefore, one of the ideas behind underdevelopment is the comparative one. It is possible to compare the economic conditions at two different periods for the same country and determine whether or not it had developed. More importantly, it is possible to compare the economics of any two countries at any given period of time. The second and even more indispensable component of modern underdevelopment is that it expresses a particular relationship of exploitation, namely the exploitation of one country by another. All of the countries named as underdeveloped, quote unquote, in the world are exploited by others. And the underdevelopment with which the world is now preoccupied as a product of capitalist, imperialist, and colonialist exploitation. African and Asian societies were developing independently until they were taken over, directly and indirectly, by the capitalist powers. When that happened, exploitation increased, and the export of surplus ensued, deriving those societies of the benefit of their natural resources and labor. That is an integral part of underdevelopment in the contemporary sense. In some quarters, it has often been thought wise of substitute the term, quote, development for underdevelopment. One of the reasons for so doing is to avoid any unpleasantness which may be attached to the second term, which meant to be interpreted as meaning underdevelopment, mentally, physically, morally, or in other respect, or in any other respect. Actually, if, quote, underdevelopment were related to anything other than comparing economies, then the most underdeveloped country in the world would be the United States, which practices in external oppression on the massive scale, while external, not internal, my bad, let me reread this. Sorry. Developed country in the world would be the United States, which practices external oppression on the massive scale, while internally there is a blend of exploitation, brutality, and psychiatric disorder. However, on the economic level, it is best to remain with the word underdevelopment rather than development, because the latter creates the impression that all the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are escaping from the state of economic backwardness relative to the industrial nations of the world, and that they are emancipating themselves from the relationship of exploitation. That is certainly not true. And many underdeveloped countries in Africa and elsewhere are becoming more underdevelopment in comparison with the world's greatest powers, because their exploitation by the metropoles is being intensified in new ways. Economic comparison can be made by looking at statistical tables or indices of what goods and services are produced and used in the societies under discussion. Professional economists speak of the national income of countries and the national income per capita. These phrases have already become part of the layman's language by way of the newspaper, and no detailed explanation will be offered here. It is enough to note that the national income is a measurement of the total wealth of the country, while the per capita income is a figure obtained by dividing the national income by the number of inhabitants in order to get an idea of the average quote-unquote wealth of each inhabitant. This quote-unquote average can be misleading, where there are great extremes of wealth. A young Ugandan put it in a very personal form when he said that the per capita income of his country camouflages the fantastic differences between what was earned by his poor peasant father and what was earned by the biggest local capitalist. Madhavening, I can't say his name, Madhvani. And considering the question of development away from the state of underdevelopment, it is of supreme importance to realize that such a process demands the removal of the gross inequalities of land distribution, property holding, and income, which are camouflaged behind national income figures. I'm having problems with income for some reason. At one stage in history, advance was made at the cost of entrenching privileged groups. In our times, development has to mean advance, which liquidates present privileged groups with their corresponding unprivileged groups. Nevertheless, the per capita income is a useful statistic for comparing one country with another. The developed country all have per capita incomes several times higher than any one of the recently independent African nations. The following table gives clear pictures of the gap between Africa and certain nations measured in per capita incomes. I'm going to get to that soon, everybody. Per capita incomes. Let's go ahead and look at the table right now. I'm just going to put a mark where I stopped, and we'll look at the table. All right. I'm going to put that right there so I can see it. Let's look at the mark. So in Canada, countries, per capita income in the US dollars. In Canada, it's 2,247. It's US, 3,578. In France, in 1967, 1,738. In United Kingdom, in 1967, 1,560. Africa as a whole, in 1965, 140. Congo, 52. Ghana, 198. Kenya, 107. Malawi, 52. Morocco, 185. South Africa, 143. Tanzania, 62. UAR, 156. Zambia, 225. This is what they just said. The following table gives a clear picture of the gap between Africa and certain nations measured in per capita incomes. So these are the per capita incomes. There you go. You have the differences. It's pretty bad. See, this is the Africans as a whole, the African nations as a whole, compared to United Kingdom, compared to France, compared to the USA, and compared to Canada. Look at all that. Pretty bad. No, I'm not showing it to you. I was saying it out before I showed it. It is the gap that allows one group to be called, quote, developed and another underdeveloped. And the information was attained from the United Nations statistical publication and applies to the year 1968, unless otherwise stated. So he gave you where he got his stuff at. The gap that can be seen from the evidence is not only great, but is also increasing. Many people have come to realize that the developed countries are growing richer quickly, quite rapidly, while the underdeveloped countries, for the most part, show stagnancy or low rates of growth. In each country, a figure can be calculated to represent the rate at which the economy grows. The growth rate is highest in socialist countries, followed by the big capitalist countries, and with the colonies and ex-colonies trailing far behind. The portion of international trade which is in the hands of the underdeveloped countries is declining. That proportion was roughly 30% in 1938 and went down to less than 20% in the 1960s. This is an important indicator because trade is both a reflection of the quantity of goods produced and a way of obtaining goods not locally produced. Developed economies have certain characteristics which contrast with underdeveloped ones. The developed countries are all industrialized. That is to say, the greater part of their working population is engaged in industry rather than agriculture, and the most are their wealth comes out of mines, factories, and other industries. They have a high output of labor per man in industries because of their advanced technologies and skills. This is well known, but it is also striking that the developed countries have as much more advanced agriculture than the rest of the world. Their agriculture has already been an industry, and the agricultural part of the economy produces more even though it is small. The countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are called agricultural countries because they rely on agriculture and have little or no industry. But their agriculture is unscientific and the yields are far less than those in the developing countries. In several of the largest underdeveloped nations, there was stagnation and fall in agriculture output in and after 1966. In Africa, the output of food per person has been falling in recent years because the developed countries have a stronger industrial and agriculture economy than the rest of the world. They produce far more goods than the poorer nations in the category of necessities as well as luxuries. It is possible to draw up statistical tables showing the production of grain, milk, steel, electric power, paper, and wide range of other goods, and showing at the same time how much of each commodity is made available to each citizen on the average. Once again, the figures are highly favorable for the few privileged countries in the world. And we're about to go into this. No. The amount of steel used in a country is an excellent indicator of the level of industrialization. At one extreme, one finds that the US consumes 164 kilometers of steel per person. Sweden, 623. In East Germany, 437. In other extreme, one finds Zambia consumes 10 kilometers. East Africa, 8. And Ethiopia, 2. Then the same kind of calculation is made for sugar. For a sample of the results shows Australia with 47 kilograms, and North America and the Soviet Union with 45 to 50 on the average. Africa, however, consumes only 10 kilograms of sugar per person per year, and this is better than Asia with 7. An even more gloomy set of statistics relates to basic food requirements. Each individual needs a certain quantity of food per day measured in calories. The desirable amount is 3,000 calories per day, but no African country comes anywhere near that figure. Algerians consume on average only 1,870 calories per day, while the Ivory Coast can consider itself very well off within an African context with 2,290 calories as a national average. Furthermore, one also has to judge the protein content of the food. In many parts of Africa suffers from protein famine, quote unquote, which means that even when categories are available from calories. When calories are available from starchy food, protein is not to be found. Persons in developed capitalist and socialist countries consume twice as much protein food as those in underdeveloped countries. With such differences help to make it clear which countries are developed and which are underdeveloped. The social service provided by the countries are an importance equal to that of its material production in bringing about human well-being and happiness. It is universally accepted that the state has the responsibility to establish schools and hospitals, but whether these are provided by the government or by private agencies, their numbers can be established in relations to the size of the population. The extent to which basic food, goods, and social services are available in a country can also be measured indirectly by looking at the life expectancies and frequency of death among children and the amount of malnutrition, the occurrence of diseases which could be prevented by inoculations and public health services, and the proportions of illiterates. In all these respects, the comparison between let me go look up this real quick. We're at the halfway. We're at the. Oh, fuck. Okay, hold on. Where was that? Where did I stop at? All right. Let me see. 1, 2. I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish. I'll have to find a stopping point. For every 1,000 children who were born alive in Cameroon, 100 never lived to see their birthday. And out of every 1,000 African children born alive in rural Sierra Leone, 160 die before reaching 1 year. Yet, the comparable figures of the United Kingdom and Holland are only 12 and 18 respectively. Besides, many more African children die before they reach the age of 5. Lack of doctors is a major drawback. In Italy, there is 1 doctor for every 580 Italians. In Czechoslovakia, there is 1 doctor for every 510 citizens. In Nigeria, 1 doctor must do for 56,140 persons. In Tanzania, 1 doctor for every 8,320 in Tanzania. And in Chad, 1 doctor for 73,460 persons. Holy crap. Let's reread that again. Yet the comparable figures of the wait. Let's go back here. In all these respects, the comparison between the developing and underdeveloped countries shows huge and even frightening differences. For every 1,000 children who are born alive in Cameroon, 100 never live. to see the first birthday. And out of every 1,000 African children born alive in Sierra Leone, 160 die before reaching 1 year. Yet comparable figures for the United States, for the United Kingdom and Holland are only 12 to 18 respective. Besides, many more African children die before they reach the age of 5. Lack of doctors is major drawback. In Italy, there is 1 doctor for every 580 Italians. In Czechoslovakia, there is 1 doctor for every 510 citizens. Now we're going to go to Nigeria. We're going to African nations now. In Nigeria, one doctor must do for 56,140 persons. In Tunisia, one doctor for every 8,030 and 320 in Tanzania, and in Chad, 1 doctor for 73,460 persons. That is ridiculous. Holy crap. Let me see something real quick. Let me see something. No, I'll look at it later. It takes a large number of skilled people to make an industrial economy function, while the countries of Africa have a willful, insignificant number of highly qualified personnel. The figures on doctors just given confirm this, and the same problem exists with engineers, technicians, agriculturalists, and even administrators and lawyers, and in some places. Mid-level skills in fields such as welding are also lacking. To make matters worse, there is at present a quote brain drain from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Western Europe. This is to say, professional technicians, high-level administrators, and skilled workers immigrate from their homes, and the small number of skilled people available to the underdeveloped world is further depleted by the lure of better pay and opportunities in developed worlds. This lopsided nature of the present international economy is strikingly brought home by the fact that the underdeveloped countries must in turn recruit foreign experts at fantastic costs. Most of the data presented so far can be described as quantitative, quote unquote. It gives us measurements of a quantity of goods and services produced in various economies. In addition, certain qualitative assessments have to be made concerning the way that a given economy is put together. For economic development, it is not enough to produce more goods and services. The country has to produce more of those goods and services, which in turn will give rise spontaneously to future growth in the economy. For example, the food producing sector must be flourishing so that workers would be healthy, and agriculture on the whole must be efficient, so that the profits or savings from agriculture would stimulate industry, heavy industry such as the steel industry, and the production of electrical power must be present so that one is capable of making machinery for other types of industries and agriculture. Now I know why Mao focused on the agriculture side a lot too. That makes sense. Lack of heavy industry, inadequate production of food, unscientific agriculture. Those are all characteristics of an underdeveloped economies. It is typical of underdeveloped economics that they do not or are not allowed to concentrate on those sectors of the economy, which in turn will generate growth and raise production to a new level altogether. And there are very few ties between one sector and another, so that, say, agriculture and industry could react beneficially on each other. Furthermore, whatever savings are made within the economy are mainly sent abroad or are fettered away in consumption rather than being redirected to productive purposes. Much of the national income, which remains within the country, goes to pay individuals who are not directly involved in producing wealth, but only in rendering auxiliary services. Civil servants, merchants, soldiers, entertainers. What aggravates the situation is that more people are employed in those jobs than are really necessary to give efficient service. And to crown it all, these people do not reinvest in agriculture or industry. They squander the wealth created by new peasants and workers by purchasing cars, whiskey, and perfume. It has been noted that, with irony, that the principal, quote, industry, end quote, of many underdeveloped countries is administration. Not long ago, 60% of the internal revenue of Dahomey went into paying salaries of civil servants and government leaders. The salaries given to the elected politicians are higher than those given to a British member of parliament, and the number of parliamentarians in the other underdeveloped African countries is also relatively high. In Gabon, there is one parliamentary representative for every 6,000 inhabitants, compared to one French parliamentary representative for every 100,000 Frenchmen. Many more figures of that sort indicate that in describing a typical underdeveloped economy, it's essential to point out the high disproportions of the locally distributed wealth that goes on into the pockets of the privileged few. Members of the privileged group inside Attica always defends themselves by saying that they pay the taxes which keep the government going. At face value, this statement sounds reasonable, but on the close examination, it is really the most absurd argument and shows total ignorance of how the economy functions. Taxes do not produce national wealth and development. Wealth has to be produced out of nature, from tilling the land, or mining the metals, or felling the trees, or turning raw material into finished products for human consumption. These things are done by the vast majority of the population, who are peasants and workers. There would be no incomes or tax if the laboring population did not work. The incomes given to civil servants, professionals, and merchants come from the store of wealth produced by community. Quite apart from the injustice in distribution of wealth. One has to dismiss the argument that, quote, the taxpayer, quote unquote, money is what develops a country. In pursuing the goal of development, one must start with the producers and move on from there to see whether the products of their labor are being rationally utilized to bring greater dependency and well-being to the nation. By paying attention to the wealth created by human labor out of nature, one can immediately appreciate that very few underdeveloped countries are lacking in the natural resources which could go into making a better life. In those cases, it is usually possible for 2 or 3 territories to combine together for their mutual benefit. In fact, it can be shown that the underdeveloped countries are the ones with the greatest wealth of natural resources, yet the poorest in terms of goods and services presently provided by and for their citizens. The United Nations surveyed the economic conditions in Africa up to 1964, had this to say about the continent's natural resources. And here's what they said. Africa is well endowed with minerals and primary energies resources. With an estimate of 9% of the world's population, the region accounts for approximately 28% of the total value of the world mineral production, 6% of the crude petroleum output. In recent years, its share of the latter is increasing. Of 16 important metals, metallic and non-metallic materials. The share of Africa in 10 varies from 20, I don't know if that's 22 to 95% of the world's production. Jesus. Actually, let's see where we're going. Actually, African potential is shown to be the greater every day, with new discoveries of mineral wealth. The agriculture side, African soil is not as rich as the picture of tropical forests might lead on to believe, but there are other climatic advantages, so that with proper irrigation, crops can be grown all the year around in most parts of the continent. The situation is that Africa has not yet come anywhere close to making the most of its natural wealth. And most of the wealth now being produced is not being retained within Africa for the benefit of Africans. Zambia and Congo produce vast quantities of copper, but that is for the benefit of Europe, North America, and Japan. Even the goods and services which are produced out inside of Africa and which remains in Africa nevertheless fall into the hands of non-Africans. Thus, South Africa boasts of having the highest per capita income in Africa. But as an indication of how this is shared out, one should note that while the apartheid regime assures that only 24 white babies die out of every 1,000 live births, they are quite happy to allow 128 African babies to die out of every 1,000 live births. In order to understand present economic conditions in Africa, one needs to know why it is that Africa has realized so little of its natural potential, and one also needs to know why so much of its present wealth goes to non-Africans who reside for the most part outside of the continent. I mean, like, sure, is there? All right. In a way, underdevelopment is a paradox. Sorry. Many parts of the world that are naturally rich are actually poor. Are actually poor, and parts that are not so well off in wealth of soil and subsoil are enjoying the highest standard of living. Wait, hold on a second, everybody. Let me reread that again. In a way, underdevelopment is a paradox. Many parts of the world that are naturally rich naturally rich are actually poor in parts that are not so well off in wealth of soil and subsoil are enjoying the highest standard of living. When the capitalists from the developing parts of the world try to explain this paradox, they often make it sound as though there is something, quote, God-given, end quote, about the situation. The bourgeoisie economist in a book on development accepted that the comparative statistics of the world today shows a gap that is much larger than it was before. By his own admission, the gap between the developed and the underdeveloped country has increased by at least 15 to 20 times over the last 150 years. However, the bourgeoisie economist in question does not give the historical explanation, nor does he consider that there is a relationship of exploitation which allows capitalist parasites to grow fat and impoverished dependency. Instead, he puts forward a biblical explanation and says, it is all told in the Bible. And here's the quote. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. Jesus Christ. All right. The stories of the have-nots is the story of modern underdeveloped countries. Presumably, the only commitment which one can make on that is amen, quote unquote. The interpretation that underdevelopment is somehow ordained by God is emphasized because of the racist trend in European scholarship. It is in line with racist prejudice to say openly or to imply that their countries are more developed because their people are innately superior, and that the responsibility for the economic backwardness of Africa lies in the genetic backwardness of the race of black African people. Ew. And even bigger problems is that the people of Africa and other parts of the colonized world have gone through a cultural and psychological crisis and have accepted, at least partially, the European version of things. That means that African himself has doubts about his capacity to transform and develop his natural environment, which such doubts he even challenges those of his brothers who say that Africa can and will develop through the efforts of its own people. If we can determine when underdevelopment came about, it would dismiss the lingering suspicion that it is radically or otherwise predetermined, and that we can do little about it. I'm going to stop there. It might not be the greatest stopping point, but it's a stopping point. Stop point. I ran it together. I think that's a good spot. Page 26. And it's underneath underdevelopment. What was it under? Look. This last section was called What is Underdevelopment? So we learned about what is development, what is underdevelopment, and what it entails, and the misperceptions of what they say about the underdeveloped world and stuff like that. What's up?
I took a lot of notes, but I hear an echo. Oh, Echo's gone. Okay. I took a lot of notes, so would you like me to go over them?
If you want to.
Okay. So, like, I was going along, and so it was at the beginning. It seemed it was the creation of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but it started with the landlord and the serf. And then it talked about the uneven development per the continent, how each continent was developing at different paces. And it talked about how religion and economic activity intertwined. And it never became capitalist as the dominant class in China. At the time, the landowners and the landlords were also in the politics, so it was like the religion and economic and the landlords with the landowners. Then came capitalism, and workers are the ones who suffer, and they must overthrow the capitalists, hence the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And then I thought this was a good note as well. The United States would be the most underdeveloped as it uses the least amount of resources. It has the least amount of natural resources while taking over other nations and stealing their resources. And then I said the birth death statistic is wild to Lind, and Lind responded to me. They did the math, and it would be 8 to 10 years to see every person just once, just for less than 10 minutes. Okay, that was everything that I paid attention to.
Okay. Sounds like a good job. I'm glad you did that. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Okay, no worries.
I didn't have any questions, but I did take a whole lot of notes but I understood everything that you read. It didn't strike me as anything that I had to ask questions on, and anything that I would have asked a question on, you went and looked up anyways.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's no worries. But yeah, I think it's important to understand, and the fact that the economists lied about the the gaps in like how the industrial nations, the developed nations, were plundering the underdeveloped nations, quote unquote, of things. So there's that huge gaps of rich countries compared to non-rich countries. So yeah.
Yeah, that was where I mentioned about the United States would be the poorest nation in actuality due to its own resources. It only does it because it oppresses all those other nations.
All right. Does anybody else have anything else? I don't think so. All right. Well, I'll close it out for the night, and we'll see you tomorrow, the next day.